till at last the child's mind is the suggestions, and the sum of the suggestions is the child's mind. And not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions, but all these suggestions are our suggestions. Welcome back, and thank you for wanting to know the facts and the truth. What's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is big. You can't miss it on the news. You can't miss it on college campuses, and you really can't miss it online. But what are the facts? Why is this happening? That's what we're here to answer. Our approach is to examine the major themes and focus on the important events that help you make sense of what's happening today. We care about knowing the truth. We also care about the basic human right to live in peace. We care about ending the suffering. We care about finding justice. And we think you're here because you do too. The only path for us then is to go after the facts and be open to what they show us. Life can be beautiful without hatred, violence, and war, and maybe the way there starts with better understanding each other. Better understanding the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, the history of their conflicts and past peace efforts, and some of the major issues standing in the way of forging real peace. What the Hell is Going On in Gaza is a 9-part series made up of 30 episodes, each designed to help you understand a different but important part of the picture. Welcome to part 8 of our series. Here we try to tackle one of the most vexing questions of recent times. Is peace even possible? And if so, how? The ideas we'll walk through are more about identifying what stands in the way, what needs to be solved in order for there to be a realistic chance for peace. Here's what we'll cover. Episode 28, How Palestinians Feel About Israelis. Episode 29, How Israelis Feel About Palestinians. And Episode 30, So What Would It Take? In order to talk about the requirements for peace, we first need to understand where Israelis and Palestinians are starting from. Here in episode 28, we'll talk about how Palestinians feel about Israelis. A good window on how Palestinians feel about Israelis is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's 2020 survey. Here are some of its findings. 71% of Gazans believe Palestinians should move to a new intifada and make armed struggle the top priority. The percentage of Gazans who believe it was a good idea to attack the following groups: all Israeli Jews, 65%. All Jews everywhere, 56%. Israeli soldiers and police, 75%. Israeli settlers, 73%. Tourists in Israel, 42%. 68% of Gazans disagree strongly or somewhat with the statement, "I hope someday we can be friends with Israelis since we're all human beings after all." 56% of Gazans believe that regaining all of Palestine, that is, from the river to the sea, should be their top priority. 58% of Gazans believe that resistance should not end until all of Palestine is liberated from the Jews. 49% of Gazans believe the resistance should be escalated even if it makes life harder now. 50% of Gazans believe that eventually Palestinians will control all of Palestine because God is on their side. And 74% of Gazans believe a large military conflict between Israel and Hamas is very or fairly likely. These results tell us that the majority of Palestinians in Gaza are angry. This is a difficult starting point for achieving peace. As a pretty clear reflection of that, one of the Israeli hostages seized by Hamas later told reporters, quote, "When we arrived in Gaza, thousands of cheering Palestinians lined the streets. The terrorists grabbed my daughter and showed her off to the crowd, boasting they'd stolen a little Israeli girl." The image below shows the results of a Gallup poll taken in December 2023. It shows us that Palestinian support for a two-state solution has fallen to 24%, the lowest level since Gallup first asked the question in 2011. The same poll showed that support for a two-state solution is much lower among younger generations, which is an ominous sign for the future. It also shows that 8 in 10 Palestinians doubt the possibility of permanent peace. One of the real tragedies of the Palestinian situation is the radicalization that's resulted from decades of relentless propaganda by Palestinian leaders, from al-Husseini to PLO leader Yasser Arafat to Hamas leaders Yahya Sinwar and Ismael Haniyeh, to so many other less high-profile Palestinian leaders, as well as others in the Muslim world, like Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini. All claim to be champions of the Palestinian cause, yet all have led the Palestinian people down the fruitless path of intransigence and violence. This radicalization is apparent in the perpetual violent attacks against Israel, in the perpetual hateful rhetoric, in the poll results we just saw, and in the Palestinians' history in other Arab countries. Jordan fought a war to expel the PLO from its country in 1970 to 1971, and later disclaimed the West Bank and its population of Palestinians, territory it had administered from 1950 to 1988. 17,000 civilians died in the battle for Amman during the Jordanian Civil War to expel the PLO. Once the PLO and its supporters moved to Lebanon, they attempted to overthrow the government, triggered the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, destabilized the nation, and set it on a path to where it is today, a ruined state. The Lebanese Civil War, brought on by the PLO, quite literally destroyed the country and its capital, Beirut, which had been known as the Paris of the Middle East. In 1990 to 1991, Kuwait expelled almost 400,000 Palestinians who lived within its borders because they were a destabilizing force and actively supported Iraq's Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. At the time, there were only about 600,000 Kuwaitis in Kuwait, so expelling the Palestinians was no small matter. Again, the radicalization of the Palestinian population has been a great tragedy. While this does not mean that all Palestinians have been radicalized, the fact is that too many have been indoctrinated into embracing the radical nationalist and Islamist ideas of their leaders. This indoctrination begins when Palestinian children are very young, in their schools from kindergarten on. It continues through their religious leaders, and it continues through relentless media propaganda. Consider these few excerpts from an article on how Hamas radicalizes Palestinian society. Quote, Palestinian children who are caught up in the Hamas dawah are taught to recognize the virtue of death for Allah. Quote, the radicalization campaign continues through the course of a Palestinian student's academic career, employing materials produced and distributed by the dawah. The Hamas Islamic student movement in the Bethlehem area distributed to young students so-called instruction cards, bearing the pictures of Hamas suicide bombers and others killed carrying out terrorist attacks, and encouraging Palestinian youth to follow in their footsteps. And here are a few excerpts from another article on how Hamas radicalizes Palestinians. Quote, it was all part of the Hamas calculus to nurture and incite terrorism. They lured so-called martyrs. Palestinians were programmed. Jihad was taught in schools and mosques. It could be read in newspapers and heard on the radio. Quote, the parents of the suicide bomber offered a window into the perverse mindset of Hamas followers. Their knowledge of the historic land conflict was superficial, if non-existent. They simply mouthed the terrorist covenant memorialized in the Hamas charter that vows the complete annihilation of Israel and the murder of all Jews. Beyond that, they seem to know almost nothing else. I found this to be a typical response in Gaza, a population indoctrinated by an ugly terrorist ideology, reliant on a culture of disinformation, anti-Semitism, and bloodshed. It's not hard to see why Palestinian society is not inclined toward peace with Israel. For decades, their leaders have brought them violence and taught them hate. If the goal of any national leadership is to bring peace and prosperity to its people, the Palestinian leadership of Amin al-Husseini, Izz-al-Din al-Qassam, Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, Yahya Sinwar, and Ismael Haniyeh has been a miserable failure. Thanks for continuing to watch our series. We hope you gained a better understanding of how Palestinians feel about Israelis and why. We learned that a significant majority of Palestinians support an armed struggle against Israel and do not hope for peaceful coexistence in the future, and that less than 1 in 4 Palestinians support a two-state solution. The overwhelming majority do not believe Israel has a right to exist. This is a very difficult situation in which to establish peace. That's one side of the table, if you imagine a peace negotiation. Next, in episode 29, we'll look at the other side of the table. If you'd like to leave a comment or get in touch, visit our website at www.getthefactsmiddleeast.com. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your interest in learning more about the war in Gaza. And remember, where there is no knowledge, there can be no insight.